So with that covered, I want to introduce you to our wonderful speakers today. First, we have Stephanie Simpson. She's the Coastal Wetland Program Manager on the Global Protect team. Andrew Davey-Greaves. He is EY-Parthenon Director, a TNC partner. Julie Robinson, the Program Director for Belize. Shenique Smith, Northern Caribbean Program Director. And Jill Bieri, the Virginia Coast Reserve Director for the Virginia chapter. So now I'll hand it over to Stephanie, who will lead our conversation today.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We have over 100 participants in this room today, so I'm really excited for the interest here about blue carbon and to share more about what we're doing with blue carbon at the Nature Conservancy. Before we dive into blue carbon and to all the different wonderful details our program folks, our regions are doing, I'm going to give a little bit of a background on what blue carbon is, just so we're all starting on the same starting point here. So to get us started, the term blue carbon, what does that even mean? It's getting passed around or tossed around a lot today, but for the purposes of this webinar today, when we say blue carbon, we're referring to the greenhouse gases captured by, stored in, and released from these three coastal ecosystems: seagrasses, salt marshes, and mangroves. Now, why only these three? Well, first, because the science is fairly solid now on how well these habitats capture and store carbon, and more on this in a bit. But secondly, we also can manage for these systems. We can actively restore, protect them, and enhance management so that we are thereby increasing their ability to naturally store carbon in their biomass and in the ground. So a quick look at what's actually happening in these systems and what makes them so special that we had to give them their own term about where they're storing carbon. Of course, as you can probably guess, carbon is captured through normal plant photosynthesis. Now, some of that carbon becomes incorporated within the vegetative biomass, but a large portion makes its way down into the soil. And this is the really important part. Because these systems are constantly wet, being in this tidal range, that soil is fairly anoxic or void of oxygen, meaning that decomposition is happening really, really slowly. So what ends up happening is we have hundreds or even thousands of years worth of carbon stored beneath these habitats in their soils. In fact, when we compare carbon storage in wetlands versus tropical forests, you can see that the vast majority of carbon storage is in the soil. And this is important because in the soil is a relatively permanent storage for carbon, as long as these habitats remain healthy and wet. You can see the sample picture on the left here. The soil core here is from a salt marsh in Maryland, showing about 1,000 years of carbon stored beneath that system. Pretty cool. The second thing to note about these systems is how fast carbon is being stored in the ground. Wetlands are really productive ecosystems. So when we compare them to what are more traditionally thought of for carbon storage, like our terrestrial forest, we see that wetlands are actually capturing and storing carbon in the ground at rates up to 10 times faster. Now, no offense to trees, of course, very important and very good carbon stores, but we also want to see our wetlands valued for this important ecosystem service as well. Another thing to note is that as these habitats trap and store carbon in the soil, these layers of carbon are actually helping to build the substrate up, allowing healthy systems to naturally accrete, keeping pace with moderate levels of sea level rise, so that they can continue to provide critical habitat for many marine species and improve the resiliency of our coast. On the flip side of that, as these habitats are drained or degraded, that stored soil carbon can be released relatively quickly back into the atmosphere, releasing what could have taken centuries to store, but releasing it in a matter of decades. Now, coastal wetlands offer us so many ecosystem benefits. In addition to providing key fisheries habitats and improving water quality and capturing and storing carbon, helping to address the cause of climate change, they also help reduce flooding and storm impacts, helping to provide a sense of resilient coast for our very vulnerable coastal communities. Now, despite all these benefits, coastal wetlands are still under increased threat of degradation and coastal development. Scientists estimate that 50% of the world's mangroves and seagrasses and at least 25% of the world's tidal marshes have already been lost. And they're still being lost at higher rates than tropical rainforest. So it's clear that we're just not doing enough yet. So that's what we're interested in this blue carbon mitigation value. It provides us with some new opportunities to elevate the importance of coastal wetland habitat restoration and conservation, adding value to this work. We can use this value to incorporate tidal wetlands into climate policies and frameworks. We can use it as an additional metric for ecosystem health, and we can connect with new partners and donors who are interested in natural climate solutions via market incentives. At the Nature Conservancy, we're leading efforts on all fronts on blue carbon in a variety of habitat types and geographies. And I have the great pleasure to work with each of our panelists today on some pretty innovative projects. So today you'll hear about some of the work that we're doing across these geographies from Belize, Virginia, and Bahamas. And you'll also hear the results of a market study that we conducted with our partners at EY. So to get us all started off, I'm going to first pass it over to my colleague, Jill Bieri, who's the director of our TNC Virginia Coastal Reserve. Jill?
Great, Steph, thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining and to all the colleagues here on the panel. It's a pleasure to speak to you today about our project at the Virginia Coast Reserve. I'm going to discuss why the Virginia Coast Reserve is the place where we will implement the first blue carbon seagrass project in the world, and why now it is happening. I'm going to highlight the successful restoration, the long-term research, and how partnerships have really provided the collaboration from the very beginning of the restoration to the present implementation of this blue carbon project that has made it all possible. So next slide, please. Where in the world, if you want to start that too, where in the world is the Virginia Coast Reserve? Well, we are on the southern portion of the Delmarva Peninsula. So portions of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia make up this peninsula. We're, of course, the Virginia portion. And our portion is 75 miles long, with the Chesapeake Bay to the west and the Atlantic Ocean to the east. We have over 133,000 acres of protected and conserved lands here. And the Brownsville Preserve is noting the headquarters for TNC's Virginia Coast Reserve here. And these 133,000 acres have been conserved over the past 50 years by the Nature Conservancy, our federal and state and other local partners. And really, we've created the last expanse of coastal wilderness along the East Coast. The point I'd like to make in terms of eelgrass and seagrass today is this extensive conserved land has really provided incredible water quality in these coastal bays that you're seeing along our peninsula, providing really the place on earth where seagrass could and is being restored successfully. Next slide, please. The long-term protection and all this conservation that we've been fortunate enough to be involved in for over 50 years here really does couple with the long-term research that's been happening, coordinated by UVA's long-term ecological research program, really make this place a living laboratory, a place to demonstrate the impacts of climate change on the natural system, including these restored seagrass beds. And as Steph mentioned, natural climate solutions, demonstrating conservation, restoration, and land management that increase carbon storage and avoids greenhouse gas emission. That's what we're showing here at the Virginia Coast Reserve. Next slide. So one of the long-term benefits of this protected landscape is really great water quality in those surrounding coastal bays, as I mentioned before. And it's allowed successful marine restoration to happen here for decades. Our eelgrass disappeared from the coastal bays in the 1930s, mostly due to a pandemic, a wasting disease, and it left our system completely devoid of seagrass, and more importantly, all the benefits that we get from the seagrass. Since the Virginia Institute of Marine Science began the restoration effort in the 1990s, we've gone from 0 to 9,500 acres of eelgrass. And that's the largest seagrass restoration effort in the world. But the benefits of that, and that's great, but the benefits of that are endless. And one of them is improved water quality and water clarity. Another is increased habitat. These grasses provide great habitat for hundreds of bottom dwelling and mobile species. Species diversity has increased with the restoration, especially finfish. And a great benefit from the restored seagrass is its ability to store carbon, both in the sediment and the leaves. It's the perfect site to implement the first ever seagrass blue carbon project. Next slide, please. This restoration of eelgrass has provided a canvas for world-class research. The University of Virginia and other research partners associated with the National Science Foundation's long-term ecological research program includes things like understanding the effect of the expansion of the seagrass on water quality, how the eelgrass is affecting currents and sediment movement, wave attenuation, how waves are dampened by the eelgrass, and even carbon storage. This is the place where UVA developed the Blue Carbon Seagrass Protocol. And the protocol defines what conditions are needed to implement a blue carbon project, how to measure the amount of carbon in seagrass and sediments, how to monitor for and account for expansion, and allow for continued restoration success in the coastal bays of Virginia. Next slide. So that's the restoration and the research. The collaboration and the partnerships that this program has provided really have been the key from the beginning. The Virginia Institute of Marine Science, with funding from the state's Coastal Zone Management Program, took the giant leap and started the restoration in the late 1990s. UVA leads and coordinates much of the research. The Nature Conservancies, our Global Oceans team, our Virginia chapter, all the way here to the Virginia Coast Reserve, we all work together to steer the process on a local to global effort. And of course, the bottom where we restored the seagrass is owned by the Commonwealth of Virginia. So they're owning and managing this resource and a partner in this project. In fact, the state bottom ownership really was what brought us to bring in the Coastal Policy Center at the College of William and Mary's Law School to determine if legislation was needed to really proceed with this project, because it is a publicly owned, a state-owned bottom. And we had legislation that passed in the General Assembly last session in 2020 and provided the authority for us to move this project forward. And that's where we are. We're moving this project forward, developing an agreement with the state, and really hoping to have this implemented in 2021. So I'll stop there, Stef, to allow other panelists time to talk.
Thanks so much, Jill. It's so exciting to hear and share about this first seagrass blue carbon offset project. A quick follow-up question before we move on to the next panelist. How has TNC mobilized the effort to get to this stage? And what's the timeline moving forward for this project?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I'll say it again, partnerships have been the key. Just there's so many moving parts and facilitating everyone sort of doing their expertise in getting the project verified, determining monitoring needs and requirements. And at the same time, we're working with the Commonwealth of Virginia, who owns the bottom, to figure out, as we move forward and we get this project underway, who will monitor and who will, you know, take the responsibilities into the future. And as I said before, we really hope to have this implemented in 2021. So keep your fingers crossed.
I certainly will. I know I'm excited to see how the project continues to unfold. Thanks so much, Jill.
Thanks.
So next up, we're going to move to Central America, to the country of Belize, and hear from TNC Belize Program Director, Julie Robinson. Julie?
Thank you, Steph, and good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. So I have the distinct privilege to take you over from Virginia to Belize, and more specifically to Turnef Atoll, as you can see here. Turnef Atoll is located some 25 miles off the coast of Belize, and it is one of 4 coral atolls in all of the Caribbean. It is the largest, most biologically diverse, and has the highest mangrove cover of all the atolls. It's also great to know that the entire atoll is currently protected within a multi-use marine reserve. Next slide. Now, the annual storm protection value of mangroves, seagrasses, and coral reefs for all of Belize has been estimated at around $5.75 billion per year. And Turnef, due to its size and its location, just to the east of Belize City, which is our old capital and largest city in the country, and its extensive vegetative coverage plays a significant role in shoreline protection. The total mangrove cover on Turnef alone is around 11,000 acres, and that represents about 1/3 of all the mangroves in Belize. So protecting these habitats from further development will sustain fisheries, it'll generate carbon credits, and buffer lives and the livelihoods from the worst effects of major storms. Next. So what is one of the major threats to maintaining the integrity of this ecosystem? Next. Now, as I mentioned, while the entire atoll is within a marine reserve, only the waters are protected. There's nothing stopping private landowners, of which there are many on Turnef, from clearing vegetation and developing their property. And while the government of Belize does provide some safeguards to protect against destructive development, like many countries around the world, we have great regulations, but insufficient resources to enforce these. Next. So let's briefly look at this one example that we can see, which has occurred in the last decade. That white scar that you see in the box there is visible from a satellite, is caused by dredging and mangrove clearing. Next. This is what we want to avoid. Dredging of pristine seagrass flats, bulldozing of mangrove forests, and ultimately the destruction of important ecosystems that provide for livelihoods. Now, down in the lower right-hand corner of this image, there's a little fishing camp there. I spoke with a fisherman who lives there, who, that area was passed down from, his grandfather to his father, and they've fished there for many decades. Fishing in those waters has changed. He now has to spend more on fuel, travel further away in order to earn a living, because the entire area has been devastated due to that development. So what you're seeing here is also only a fraction of the destruction. And I'll tell you on a personal note, it really pains my heart every single time I see this photo or every single time I visit this site. Development can absolutely occur, but it does not have to happen like this. And so this is where we come in. Next. So please bear with me while I walk you through our Belize Blue Carbon model, which will be implemented in partnership with the Turnef Atoll Sustainability Association. They are the co-managers for the Marine Reserve and one of our closest partners here in Belize. The example project size that we're using for this model is to protect and avoid deforestation of 200 hectares of mangroves that would generate approximately 106,000 tons of carbon offsets over 20 years. Along with investments from other partners, such as the Protected Areas Conservation Trust and the Belize Marine Fund, we aim to certify the offsets under the Verified Carbon Standard, as well as the new Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, generating blue carbon resilient credits. The government of Belize would need to allocate the carbon rights to the private landowners, who would then enter into a collaborative agreement that would allow for them to donate some of those offsets back to the Nature Conservancy. TNC will then retire and monetize those offsets, with the proceeds going towards several different things. It would go directly back toward to the Turnef Atoll Sustainability Association for management costs. It would go into monitoring and evaluation for the project, capitalization of a $2.4 million endowment fund that will help to protect Turnef in perpetuity, and cost recovery. There's also potential for some of that to go back to the landowners and through a collaborative agreement. So these are things that we are currently talking about. So this project, while small, does provide a critical proof of concept by demonstrating how mangrove conservation can provide financial returns as well as climate and resilience benefits. We can pave the way for expansion, not just within Turnef and in Belize, but to project sites all across the globe. And that's it. Sorry.
No, thanks so much, Julie. This is a really exciting project to see develop. I also understand that recent elections in Belize, there's a new administration coming on board, and that the government has identified a minister of blue economy. Which sounds really exciting and intriguing. So I was just wondering, how do you see this blue carbon project on Turnef possibly helping to influence climate policy for Belize as a whole?
Well, I'm a proud Belizean, and I have to say that Belize has always been a global leader in conservation, and the creation of a Ministry of Blue Economy is just another great example of that. In speaking with the new ministry, I am really pleased to share that they are currently looking to develop a blue economy strategy for the country that will take into consideration all the uses and users of our marine resources. This will include blue carbon and will provide an opportunity for the development of national level policy and governance framework. Their commitment to sustainable management and including blue carbon is really inspiring. And I can't tell you how excited I am to see what this upcoming year will look like for us. The elections were just recently, it's a very new ministry, just a few months old, so we're off to a really great start.
Thanks, Julie. That is really exciting. So I'm going to pass it over to our next panelist here. And we're going to travel across the Gulf of Mexico here to the island nation of the Bahamas and hear from Shenique Smith. Shenique is TNC's Northern Caribbean Program Director. Shenique?
Thanks, Stephanie. And I'm so happy to be here to share today on some of TNC's emerging work on blue carbon in the Bahamas. If you can go to the next slide, please. Although the Bahamas is one of the top countries for being at risk to the impacts of climate change, this topic is still gaining traction in terms of awareness and national dialogue. Following 4 major storms in the past 6 years, the latest being Hurricane Dorian in September 2019, climate change and its impacts on people, nature, and economies in the Bahamas was elevated in national discussions. Next slide for me. Dorian resulted in a loss of at least 10% of the Bahamas' GDP, in addition to estimated damages of approximately $3.4 billion. Next slide. Dorian also brought unprecedented storm surge and flooding on the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama, underscoring the need for the coastal protection and flooding benefits of coastal ecosystems like mangroves. In response, the government of the Bahamas has taken some tangible steps to advance climate action in the country. The Climate Change Adaptation and Research Center was established at the University of the Bahamas. A climate change unit was created within the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection, and there was the creation of a new ministry, the Ministry of Disaster Preparedness, Management, and Reconstruction. All of this representing groundbreaking institutional arrangements to support climate action in the Bahamas. At the same time, the government has prioritized development of a stronger blue economy and is actively exploring ways of getting new revenue streams for the country. So TNC's blue carbon work is timely. Restoration of mangroves not only supports climate mitigation and coastal resilience, but can potentially support a new revenue stream for the country. Next slide. With the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection's endorsement, TNC will conduct a blue carbon market and policy pre-feasibility analysis to assess the blue carbon and resilience credit potential for mangrove restoration sites in the Bahamas. To guide this project and to ensure that it meets national needs, we have formed a project advisory group of key government and NGO stakeholders. The pre-feasibilities will focus on sites on the islands of Andros and Grand Bahama, and we are now in the initial stages of this analysis and hope to have the study completed by early summer. It should be noticed that the analysis will also support climate policy in the country. The Bahamas is right now updating its nationally determined contribution, which will serve as an overarching policy document to guide climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts over the next 5 years. The carbon sequestration potential of sites in TNC studies will be calculated, and this information will be shared with the ministry to support the revision of the NDC. So we're really hopeful about the impact that this work can have both for blue carbon, but also for climate policy and action here in the Bahamas.
Great, thanks, Shenique. It's very exciting to hear how the government is really just jumping on board with this and really wanting to further understand the value that these habitats are providing. You mentioned the important role that coastal habitats have in the Bahamas, specifically to mitigate some of the effects of storms and flooding. What types of threats are currently being posed to these habitats, to healthy and living coastal wetlands in Bahamas?
So in terms of mangroves and other coastal wetlands, the biggest threat I think would be coastal development. And this takes the form of things like dredging for docks, marinas, other things, deforestation, indiscriminate dumping, and also altered hydrology due to roads and causeways. So this is some of the challenges these coastal ecosystems are facing here in the Bahamas.
Well, we'll hope that blue carbon can help further promote reasons to save them and restore these habitats. So thank you again, Shenique. So last but certainly not least, I want to turn it to our next panelist. Andrew Davey-Greaves is a partner of the Nature Conservancy. He's a director at EY-Parthenon and was going to share some results from a market study that we did on blue carbon resilient credits. Andrew?
Thanks, Steph. My team, including Whitney Hayes, had the great pleasure of partnering with the Nature Conservancy in the fall to embark on a market research study to best understand what the willingness to pay and market appetite was for a blue carbon resilience credit. When I say blue carbon resilience credit, we're thinking about this as a stacked credit. So you have the offset generated from the coastal ecosystem project. And then on top of that, you have the incremental benefit of the resilience credit. So the resilience from, say, perhaps the mangrove forest that's protecting the population that's living close to the shore. We did a series of interviews, surveys, and focus groups with a set of TNC partners and found 4 main observations that we wanted to share with you today. First, we found that there's a small but growing market for blue carbon offsets at a premium price. I want to draw your attention to the graph at the edge of the #1 box here. One of the questions that we asked our respondents in a survey was, at what price would a blue carbon resilience credit begin to seem expensive to you? Our average price was $15. We had a number of people between about 9 and 16. But very interestingly, we had a sharp tail to the right. We had some people tell us that that would be worth $21 to them, $30, $40 is the price at which it would begin to seem expensive, which is one of the best proxies to think about the appetite and willingness to pay. What that means is that this whole market is being driven up by an increase in carbon neutrality goals and the storytelling benefits. But at the very far right, we have a small number of buyers who value this, you could say even above the premium at a super premium price point. Those buyers tend to acknowledge that there's high program costs, especially for what organizations like TNC are setting out to do. And they want to pay at the social cost of carbon, not just the lowest price point that they can find in the market. Second, we saw that the primary driver of this overall price point that people were setting was primarily the blue carbon offset, but that incremental value of the resilience credit was real, and it was greater based on what someone put as their willingness to pay. So what you see in the second graph is that for folks who said we're on the lower end, they said it was worth $5 to them, maybe they pay another $1 for the resilience credit. As we move up the curve, those people who valued the offset also valued the resilience credit and valued it more highly. So they were saying that it was $5, $10, even at the high end, $20 of incremental value. This is a really valuable point because these are not organizations that have a resilience target per se, in the way that organizations can have a carbon offset target. They are doing this because they think it is worth pursuing, and in part because it tells a story that they haven't been able to tell before and deliver a benefit that is new to the market. Third, when we probe deeper in terms of what was driving this high value, we unanimously heard 2 things. First, that offsets need to be verified and trustworthy for it to increase value for them, and for offsets to include measurable co-benefits. That first element of verified and trustworthy, we were hearing people say, our offsets need to be airtight. As public companies or companies coming under scrutiny for how they report, they do not want to be on the front page of the newspaper with the headline that their offsets were not actually what they were said to be. Second, we found that the measurable co-benefits were really substantial, and things like the CCB standards were top of mind for our respondents. Lastly, we found that future project sites can be chosen perhaps by environmental and political factors. What this means is that when we take a very wide angle lens to the map of coastal ecosystems around the world, there are going to be some countries that may not be top of mind today, but are very high potential locations because they both have extensive coastlines and they have the right socio-political conditions to allow a project to succeed, which means that they have a government that strongly protects coastal ecosystems, and that they have a government that can continue to define the protection and be a safe place to operate. Thanks, Stef.
Thanks so much, Andrew. From your different conversations with the corporate participants, were there emerging trends that you saw that are driving interest or future interest in offsets being purchased, or how corporations are setting their offset goals?
Yeah, one of the emerging trends was being able to tell a story that was deeply connected with the brand and mission. And that's become more possible as the set of offsets has diversified in the market. For some organizations, they've been offsetting with traditional forest projects for years, but that may not feel connected with their brand. Some of these companies are located on the coast. They already have philanthropic initiatives connected with oceans, waterways, coastal lands, and to be able to have their offsets tell that same story was a major added benefit. So we will continue to see, with a wider range of offsets in the market, companies really looking to integrate their offset story with their brand and mission.
Great, thanks for sharing. Very interesting study. So at this time, we've seen a lot of questions coming in. Thank you all who have already submitted their questions. Please continue to submit those in the question and answer box. We'll go ahead and take the remainder of this time today to ask some of these questions for our panelists. So let's get started here with a couple of questions here. So first, let me put this first question to you, Jill. What are some of the projects, since we've talked about this Virginia project as being kind of a landmark project and heading towards crediting soon, the question is, what are some of the lessons learned as this project has developed that you hope will help with projects in other regions and habitat types?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yes, there have been lots of lessons learned. And I hope that the lessons that we have learned can be used by entities across the coastal United States, that are implementing blue carbon projects or hoping to or thinking about it, and really across the world, just to maybe learn from a few things. So I could probably go on and on about lessons learned, but I'll highlight a couple that come to mind. One is the facilitation that we were, the Nature Conservancy kind of took the lead on in terms of process and in terms of funding. There's a lot of moving, complicated parts, and that we could play the role in sort of bringing together a lot of that, I think was really helpful. And allowed everyone to see sort of from different angles and making sure we have everything in order to move this to a real project. So I'm going to say facilitation is pretty important. I guess I'll also say patience. We've been thinking about this project for a long time, and you don't know what you don't know as you start something as complicated as this. And so, who knew we would have to have legislation passed that would give authority to the state? Who knew how long it would take to figure out how to get the project verified? All of those things, patience is always a good thing. And I'll just really quickly say, the fact that we are dealing with publicly owned bottom, I hope the lessons we have learned on how to deal with that can be used not only for marine blue carbon projects, but maybe even terrestrial projects that might be on publicly owned land. So I hope that's a lesson we can share.
That's great. Yes, I could definitely see the transferability of this project. Next, I'm going to ask the next question to, I think this is going to go to Shenique. Shenique, you mentioned, we talked about a lot of the interest the government has in tidal wetlands and blue carbon and how this can be incorporated into climate policy. the question is, how is TNC, or how are you engaging with the government in the Bahamas Blue Carbon Feasibility Assessment?
Sure. So we are actually partnering with the Ministry of the Environment on the study. We made sure we got their endorsement, and we are using their feedback to help us guide what we are looking at and really closely investigating in the study. So that's one way we're engaging with government. Additionally, we formed a project advisory council that's made up of a few government agencies. So Ministry of the Environment, of course, the Ministry of Works. We have the University of the Bahamas, the government university, on that advisory body, again, to get feedback and to make sure we are closely aligned and getting buy-in, strong support from the government. And then another way we're interacting with government. So our program has a seat on the National Climate Change Committee here in the Bahamas that really is looking at climate change matters and policy for the nation. And via that seat on the Climate Change Committee, we are going to be actually directly supporting the update of the NDC for the Bahamas and using some of the information we're going to get from the study, as well as other data and sources of information TNC has to help provide technical support with updating the NDC in country.
That's great. It really does seem like, from Bahamas and Virginia and across the board, the partnerships and the stakeholder engagement is a really key part of these projects, of the whole process. So I'm going to go to Julie next. There's a couple of different questions that have come up about, I think, that very striking slide you shared about that land that was cleared. And so I'm not sure if you could probably say, there was one question about who owned that land. I don't know if we could actually divulge that, but as kind of going along with some of the different questions, I think it'd be helpful to maybe gather from you, what can be done to prevent that type of clearing, or what is, I think you mentioned some sustainable or kind of different kind of development. That development can happen, but a different way. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that and how what that approach is on Ternef.
Sure. So it really goes back to what we've been talking about, which is partnerships. So much of Ternef is owned by private landowners, and because it is so far offshore, there's very few resources to be able to enforce legislation and regulations. What often happens is areas will get cleared and dredged without going through the right permitting process. And then those landowners will just pay the penalty because it's much cheaper to do that than to go through an actual environmental impact assessment, for example. So the reason why we've chosen to do this is that we're partnering with the landowners. We're sitting down, we're talking with them. We want to get their buy-in, we want to get their stewardship, and for them to, first of all, see the value of these habitats, not just for their intrinsic value, but also for the value for any development that they would want to do. So any development, like I mentioned, development can occur, but it can be done in a way that has minimal impact on the habitat. And so by partnering with them through this Blue Carbon Initiative, it'll enable us to abate those threats of that type of clear cutting that we see can happen, and also for in order to scale this up and to really have the type of impact that we want on the ground.
Great, thanks, Julie. I think you cut out for just a moment, but I think the big takeaway is it sounds like really working with the landowners and kind of making this, again, a very partnering kind of effort to work with them and how they're developing and how they see the value of these habitats. So that's very encouraging to hear. Can't wait to see how this project develops as well. We've had a number of questions come through about the market and about credits. So Andrew, I'm going to cue you up next for some of these. So some of these questions are talking about, how are the offsets quantified and verified and tracked? I'll just do a note on that offsets through the voluntary carbon market are tracked through carbon standards and registries. So these are globally recognized organizations that are charged with tracking and making sure that the process of generating credits is transparent. You can go online, you can see these registries and see credits as they come online. You can kind of see all the background accounting procedures and whatnot. So there is a very rigorous process to that. But the kind of building off of that, Andrew, the question is, does the perceived accuracy or transparency of the offsets being generated, does that affect the perceived value or the willingness to pay?
I think that it could affect value. One question that we probed into was the level of interest in being an early player in this. And one thing that we heard was, we would do this with an organization that we have a longstanding relationship with that has a proven track record like TNC. But we wouldn't necessarily do that with an organization that is just starting up in this space. So they recognize that there is a degree of challenge here in getting it all right, but they trust TNC's process and methodology. We also see an appetite to get involved at an investment level and really have more involvement from the early stage rather than just buying the offset. And to one note, I saw a question on investment. There are a number of organizations that have historically been willing to invest in these projects when they are mature. We have more people saying, yes, in the next 3 to 5 years, I could see our organization being an early investor or a ramp investor and being those first dollars committed, which is really valuable to helping a project get off the ground, to have an organization commit upfront when something is still in the pilot stage and say, yes, we are interested in putting dollars behind this.
Great, that's really interesting. And kind of building off that, another question is, as you talk about what you're seeing and what you heard from these different conversations and those willing to pay more for credits, are you hearing this from certain sectors? Are there certain sectors that are rising above this in the conversation as far as their interest in blue carbon credits and resilient credits?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've seen the upper end of the market play out in a couple of different ways. Some of these organizations are very deeply established and in climates that have a higher willingness to pay. So some of our top respondents were European companies that had been carbon neutral and making these commitments for the last 10 years. We saw some organizations that find specific benefits out of these projects in particular. Two interesting examples are insurance and oil and gas. Insurance can find value because they may be protecting, they may have insurance policies on properties in coastal ecosystems. So there's a core business value to them of using their offset to protect those areas because it can drive down the amount of insurance that they need to pay out. We haven't heard that this was any organization's core strategy, but we did hear, yeah, from an insurance perspective, there is a clear connection to their business. Second, on the oil and gas side, an oil and gas company would not be interested in an offset project that is, say, methane flaring. It is far too close to what their core business is. So by being able to protect coastal ecosystems, they're able to create an environmental value and tell a story that is separate from their core business and some of the impact the impact that results from their operations. So that is an angle as well. So we see a very diverse group. And as these products go to market, there could be different new players emerging, such as hospitality or cruise lines that also have a vested interest in protecting the coastline, who we didn't speak to through this study, but we could imagine emerging in the future.
Great, so maybe we have an idea of who we can target for some of these blue carbon credits in the future. So I'm going to pass, I think, this next question to Julie. And this question is about, so you mentioned about how the offsets would be generated through the certification process, and then about kind of donating and donating to TNC, and then TNC doing kind of that framework. There's just kind of a question of kind of clarifying, like who will be generating those offsets, and who will be doing the donating, and why was this kind of pathway chosen? Maybe you could go into more detail for that.
Sure. Yeah. So it's through the partnership. Will be the offsets will be generated through the partnership with the Federal Sustainable Association, TNC, other partners, and private landowners. and that will be verified. TNC will then take those to market, and the proceeds from those will go back into management. In terms of why choosing that path, I think it really has to do with pooling our resources. Belize is, very small country, very small population. Our organizations are small. So by coming together and pooling our resources, we're able to do this more efficiently rather than trying to do it individually. And so, and it's also, Turnef is one of these places that's actually quite complicated. And while I speak of Turnef, I also just want to remind everybody that this is really just an example. And as we take this and scale it across the rest of the country and other places, it's very complicated in terms of land ownership. And so this is, we're looking at creating this framework that would allow for multiple ways in which the offsets can be generated, and the proceeds from that can go back into protection. I'm not sure if I answered that well enough, but.
I think it makes sense to me. Hopefully it makes sense to the questioner. I'm a little bit more familiar with the projects though. So, but yes, I mean, putting together this framework, knowing that this is all of these are pilot projects. And so we're continuing to learn as we go, developing these frameworks. And it really seems like that that stakeholder engagement throughout, and having a diverse array of stakeholders in all of these projects is really a key part of this. Let's see, let's go to the next question here. This might be a little bit more technical, but there's a question, I think Jill, we're talking about seawater or sea level rise forecast, and how that can make it more difficult to select different sites to work in, as far as I think probably permanence to some of these offsets. And I'd welcome other panelists to jump in this question as well. I'm gonna put you on the spot, Jill, to start us off, is how sea level rise kind of factors into these projects.
Sure, and of course it has to affect, as we think about the future, and not only where we're doing the restoration, but how it will affect the grasses that have already been restored. So, as we work to verify this project and develop a monitoring protocol, we're really looking at models and data and research to do the best risk assessment that we possibly can. So I'll just leave it at that. Steph, if you have any more technical information, but it's definitely something we consider, not only in the restoration, but in thinking about this project moving forward, and how many credits will we be able to generate, and how it will be monitored, et cetera.
Right, and I can just add in there, one thing I remember about this, the seagrass project in particular, because you're right, we have to take in sea level rise considerations and considering the permanence of these projects, but also recognizing that these are very dynamic landscapes to be working in. And so, looking at sea level rise over the coming years and how resilient these projects might be, we covered a slide at the beginning of this to show how healthy systems can actually help to keep pace with moderate sea level rise, because while they're capturing that carbon, that organic material is actually building up, helping them to accrete over time. And that is actually something we've seen with the Virginia project, that the accumulation rate of sediment in the seagrass meadows is actually exceeding the rate of sea level rise at the moment. And so in that effect, the more seagrasses are capturing and storing carbon in the sediment, they are actually helping to build up that substrate. And so in that sense, that system is quite resilient right now for sea level rise. So that's a great benefit for and promoting kind of the health, seeing how a healthy ecosystem can help with that adaptation to sea level rise as well. Did any of the other panelists want to talk about sea level rise? Make sure I give everyone a chance. Okay, then I'm going to pass the next question back to Andrew. This one is about, I think, in investments or clients. How well known is blue carbon among investment managers looking for these type of investments? says is return enough for their clients, and I guess I'm wondering, I guess that means the return on investment. So maybe you can kind of share any insights that you had from discussions with participants about their familiarity with blue carbon and what the return on investment they were looking for.
Sure. When we spoke with our respondents, they were not necessarily able to speak to how versant their organizations were in this. But there is always an appetite for these new projects. Where we saw the differentiation was in terms of how organizations thought about that payback. We did not hear any one hurdle rate. They weren't saying, oh, we need a 5% or 10% return on our investment. Instead, it talked to us about how they expected the project to go. So if the project was able to stay on timeline and say, okay, we've got we're going to do this restoration, and within a couple years, it will start generating credits, and it's going to run for X number of years. If it meets those targets and meets the output that was set at the beginning, that's what they're really looking towards. So they will have their own, I think, detailed methodology for thinking about the return on the investment. And what they're really looking for from the provider is, can you hit the number of credits that you laid out when you were piloting this project, or rather assessing this area before building the project? And can you do it in the time frame that you targeted? So those were the two buckets that we were really hearing from the investor perspective.
Very interesting. Yeah, time frame is always tough, especially in the conservation world. Trees are going to grow, or wetlands are going to grow at their own pace sometimes, no matter how much we help them. So I want to, I've got conscious of time, want to keep us on. I'm going to have one more question that I want to just give to our other three panelists, Julie, Jill, and Shenique, coming from our programs. So first, Shenique has already talked about some of the ways that the Bahamas program is engaging with the government for their project through the advisory members as part of the project team. Maybe Jill and Julie, I think you both kind of touched on it, but maybe you could touch a little bit more on how TNC is engaging with the government on these projects. I'll let you go first, Jill.
Sure. Yeah, as I mentioned, the actual restoration of the seagrass in the coastal bays is happening on state-owned bottoms. So it is a resource that is owned and managed by the Commonwealth of Virginia. So they are, of course, a partner in this program. And we work with them from the very beginning, from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, doing the initial restoration and continuing with the restoration. We work with the state through the University of Virginia, through the research that's happened over decades in this site that's helped to bring this project to fruition. And then we're working with the state agencies. So, once the legislation was passed, it really gave the Department of Environmental Quality the authority to oversee this project and own the carbon credits. And as we move forward, we're working with the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, is also a state agency that manages this, and figuring out how TNC can play a role with the Department of Environmental Quality, with the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, and get these carbon credits to market. So, it is just so intertwined with working with state agencies that I can't underscore that enough.
So in terms of Belize, one of the advantages we have is we have a wonderful 30-year history here where we have a successful carbon project. So with that history, we are able to engage with multiple government departments. There's a huge amount of overlap between the departments. So even prior to the administration changing late last year, we were meeting with the Forest Department, whose mandate is over the mangroves. We were meeting with the Fisheries Department, who has the mandate over TNF, meeting with the Climate Change Office. And so we've been just having multiple engagements and meetings to discuss discuss the model and see how do we actually build this out. And now, as you mentioned, with the new administration and a new Ministry of Blue Economy, I think that kind of just brings it all together. And it's going to make it, I think, even easier for us to be able to engage with all these various departments, because now we'll have a single ministry which will help us to develop this project and actually scale it up.
Great. And I'd love to get the last word in here to Shenique. I know the project there is still early in getting off the ground, but in working with the Belize program, but also the larger Caribbean area, I was hoping maybe you could share your perspective on how you see some of this work expanding beyond Bahamas, beyond Belize, and into other geographies.
I think there's great opportunity for this work to expand, particularly in the Caribbean region where we are, the Bahamas and Belize. The natural resources of all of these countries are very critical. Most of the countries are tourism-based, looking at things like diving, boating, fly fishing. So these ecosystems such as mangroves, seagrass beds, corals are critical to supporting that ecosystem and ecology. We also see much opportunity on how can we find ways to better value conservation and protection of ecosystems. Often, traditionally, we've come at it from the kind of, this is good for the environment, but more and more we're being forced to actually enter the conversation from an economic justification. It's not just good for the environment, but how can it help with creation of jobs? How can it help with revenues and stimulating economies? So I think the proposition here with protection of coastal ecosystems, at the same time, the economic value that's potentially going to be there from blue carbon really gives the opportunity for this to grow throughout the region. And I think it will catch on as it gets more mature, both globally and regionally.
Great, so well said. I think that I completely agree. It's such an interesting connection between the habitat and the economy of things and resilience. It's very exciting. All these projects, very innovative. That we're about wrapping up our time here today. So I want to say thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your work and your perspectives today. I know there were a number of questions we did not get to, but we will be answering those and sending those out afterwards. At this point, I'd love to pass it back to Emily to close it out.
Thanks, Stef. You covered a few key points, which is that we will be sending you the responses to the questions, this PowerPoint deck, and also the recording. So thank you so much to the panelists for joining. Thank you, participants, and the amazing questions. It's great that we still have over 20 questions that haven't been answered, so we will be getting back to you. And thank you for your interest in blue carbon. Have a great day.